Hello and welcome to this edition of the Halcyon podcast. My name's Will Rising. I'm going to be your host for this episode. Thank you very much for joining me. Please take a seat, get comfy, stick your feet up, indulge yourself in the warm embrace of my silky smooth voice. What are we going to be talking about in this edition? Well, a couple of things. Number one, I want to talk about the aftermath of Khabib versus Conor McGregor. I want to talk about a couple of footballing related issues, but majoritively I want to talk about little old me and the channel and a couple of other things. So let's get the obvious out of the way. Conor McGregor versus Khabib Nurmagomedov. I didn't call it, unfortunately. I was a round out, and obviously the decision wasn't a decision. It was a rear naked choke / neck / jaw crank. Good fight. Excellent fight. I thoroughly enjoyed it when I watched it back. I think the card itself delivered pretty well, considering that Derrick Lewis is now going to be taking on Daniel Cormier at UFC 230, which is an absolutely massive bout. I still have DC winning that fight. I think he's just the superior athlete and the superior UFC fighter. But Derrick Lewis has good knockout power in his repertoire, considering that he was losing against Volkov, who, by the way, was huge. You really didn't know who he was until the UFC 229 card, and when I saw him step up to the official weigh-in, god damn, that's one big rooski. But at the same time, he lost, so now we can forget about him. I'm just joking. But at the same time, it's worth pointing out that Derrick Lewis has pulled out one hell of a knockout, and more to the point, has endeared himself with the fans with one of the most bizarre post-fight conversations ever. But you get over how you get over. And sometimes you get over with just the one-off comment that people really resonate with. Some, Stone Cold Steve Austin, it was Stone Cold, bottom line, blah, blah, blah. The Rock says, Derrick Lewis, my balls was hot. So, hey, who among us can't relate to our testicles being overheated? But at the same time, Conor McGregor versus Khabib. Now, it's a complex situation. What I want to focus on as far as the podcast is concerned is simple. What should happen as a result? When you consider, and what I've seen a lot of from the UFC pundits and from the analysts since is quite simple, which is that the Conor McGregor bus incident is not related to this incident, and therefore you can't judge them on similar merits. I call bullshit on that. I don't understand where that logic comes from. If you want to say that they're unrelated incidents, yes, I can sort of see the logic. But as far as not judging Conor McGregor by the same standard as Khabib Nurmagomedov now, I'm sorry, there's a clear worst case scenario out of those two scenarios, and it was Conor McGregor. Conor McGregor physically hurt two people. He ruined a UFC card. Khabib Nurmagomedov, yes, acted tremendously inappropriately and should face some sort of sanction. But because Conor McGregor didn't, he shouldn't. And I don't understand where the conversation perpetuates from there in terms of a ban, or in terms of stripping him of the title or a fine, because Conor McGregor faced no such sanctions or bans. The argument being that he was out anyway, well, fine. And the UFC are trying to entice him back to a fight, which is when they offered him Khabib at a certain price, rather than giving him any other fights. I would imagine that they floated the Diaz fight past him a couple of times now that they're able to offer both fighters the kind of money it would take to get them in the ring for a third installment. But at the same, and especially if they were to have it at 155, that adds a new element to the, and obviously there's a catch. It's the rubber match. It gives us the clear winner of the series. But the fact that they looked at that situation with Conor and decided on balance not to punish him in any way, shape or form, and yet in this situation the Nevada State Athletic Commission could very well ban him for up to a year, some people are saying, which would inevitably mean that he's stripped of the title. Who exactly does that benefit? It doesn't benefit Khabib Nurmagomedov for obvious reasons, and he says that withholding his fight purse of $2 million isn't going to stop him from walking out of the UFC, even if they ban him. But more to the point, if his teammates aren't reinstated to the UFC, the two teammates who jumped the octagon barrier and attacked Conor McGregor, which by the way is a completely separate issue if you want to ask me. Conor McGregor wasn't injured, he refused to press charges, but they should be punished, I get that. Artem Lobov was taken off the UFC fight card that it pertained to, so he faced a punishment. They're talking about putting Artem Lobov against one of the attackers, settling it in the octagon. There's a great story, and more to the point, it balances things up. And if you want to suspend them for a time, then fine. You can always make that fight down the line. But those two, yes, they should be pursued criminally because technically what they did was assault. They were not sanctioned to fight. They didn't have a license to fight Conor McGregor. So them attacking him is a physical assault. Same with Khabib going over the octagon barrier and attacking Conor McGregor's entourage. But the saying that I've seen a lot of is who's going to come out of this the best, which is Conor McGregor. I'm not sure. I'm really not sure about that. I think that considering Conor McGregor's current stock, he's got something of the Rousey about him now. What I mean by that? Well, I think he's had one eye out the door even before the McGregor fight. One more time. The Mayweather fight. Since that fight was signed and sealed, and he knew he was going to get a guaranteed 9-figure payday. Well, who exactly is not going to be affected by that? Who's not going to lose motivation? It's impossible not to. You are now financially set for life. If you play your cards right, your children and your children's children are set for life. Who the hell is going to keep motivation to want to be going to be the best? More to the point, Conor McGregor's ascendancy to the title and ascendancy to the point that he is now was always much more interesting than now trying to figure out. Because unfortunately, once you get to the top, you're now the person that everyone's aiming for, which means that your inadequacies and your weaknesses become that much more apparent. When you're the guy everyone's worrying about on the way up, you're a lot harder because people are reacting to you. Now, people are planning for you. Khabib Nurmagomedov has probably known his game plan against Conor McGregor for a year, maybe 2. So the fact that he's gone into that fight supremely confident, even though it's his first ever experience of being in a properly world-class environment where everyone in the world is going to be watching him, a legitimate super fight, he might have shown some nerves and he might have been cagey. Again, I called that first round cagey, but they weren't. It was Khabib getting the takedowns, Conor defending for the majority, no one really landing any solid shots. It was only in the second round that things started picking up from a hits perspective, with Conor taking a massive right hand that put him down, not knocked him out or staggered him, but certainly made him lose balance and hit the arse. And then towards the back end of the round, Khabib just teeing off with the ground and pound. Again, not doing any significant damage, but since the video coming out of Khabib talking to Conor, just, let's talk, we're talking now, let's talk. Fucking terrifying. If anyone didn't understand why Khabib Nurmagomedov is terrifying before this fight, they understand now. Someone who hits as hard and as well as Conor McGregor, unable to utilise any kind of striking techniques for fear of being planted on his ass. And then Khabib just wrapping himself around Conor to the point where Conor can barely defend himself. It was an exhibition of dominance. People don't want to say it was dominant because they still want to believe in the hype and the ability of Conor to say, well, if he could have just launched that left hand and landed and teed off and managed his energy a bit better. But he didn't. It was a dominant performance. I can't even make the argument, really. I gave it to him. I gave the third round to Conor McGregor. Why? Because Khabib took his foot off the gas massively. Didn't land anywhere near as many takedowns. Didn't land as many strikes. Conor was able to get more in the way of offense and chase Khabib down to a degree and landed some shots. But it was tight. I didn't think Conor dominated the round. I think you could make an argument for either one of them winning that round because the accumulative damage wasn't there from Conor's side. But still, for the sake of fairness, you've got to give it where you can, and Conor McGregor got that round for me. But it was still 3-1 with Khabib picking up the win. Now, what should happen? For my mind, Khabib should face a sanction, and he should face a fine. But I believe he should appeal that on the basis of, hang on a second, Conor didn't face a ban, Conor didn't face a fine. If the state of Nevada wants to pursue criminal charges against him, then they can, but considering that Conor McGregor has already dropped all charges in his instance, and he'll probably instruct his camp to do the same, because he wants that rematch with Khabib, it should all amount to nothing. What really should happen here is that Conor, if he wants it, should get his wish, which is a straight rematch with Khabib Nurmagomedov. If that rematch happens, it'll be very interesting to see if Conor McGregor can adapt to that as he did with Nate Diaz. The difference there, though, is that both fighters at one point in the original Diaz fight had moments of dominance. Conor wasn't really able to tee off the way he wanted to, but did do significant damage and did hurt Diaz in parts, but Diaz was ultimately the one that landed the shot that rocked Conor, and then ultimately made him take the fight to the ground. Conor's the one who initiated there, and then gave up his back during the course of a ground and pound while he was still dazed, and then ended up with a rear naked choke. Khabib is a superior wrestler, but in terms of a jiu-jitsu practitioner, is superior to Khabib. So my question would be, if Conor can maybe amend his game to be more floor-based. He's not going to beat Khabib in a wrestling match, but is there no way perhaps he can implement some ground game to make himself slightly more dangerous in that position? Because unfortunately, if Khabib's idea is to constantly take him to the ground, and Conor is not really able to utilise any on-the-feet attack because unfortunately a kick leaves him open to a single leg. Leans in too heavily with a punch. He gives up his midsection, which leaves him open for the takedown. Then he needs to be a bit cleverer. He needs to think, okay, well maybe I need to think about what I'm going to do when I get down there, apart from defend and get back to my feet. It's difficult and it might take him some time. But if he was to say to Khabib, I want you in a year's time, and the commission in the meantime says, okay, well we'll give Khabib a 3-month suspension or a 6-month suspension and allow him to keep the title, defend it in between the 6 months and the year that Conor needs, because Conor doesn't need any fights right now. He's got plenty of money, and it's not as if him going away for a while is going to diminish his stardom. He'll still be 31 by the time he comes back. Hell, you could build that second fight to be just as big as this one if you really wanted to. But we'll see. I mean, for my money, Khabib should not be sanctioned and should not be fined based on the precedent you set with Conor McGregor. Unfortunately, though, he is likely to face sanction and he is likely to be fined, which I find to be tremendously hypocritical given the circumstances. Because, coming back to my original point, they are linked. Khabib Nurmagomedov has had a chip on his shoulder ever since Conor McGregor led a crew of 50 people to assault a bus. People on that bus were terrified that it was some kind of terrorist attack. And yet, Conor McGregor faced no fine or due punishment, really, for that offence. If you want to make the argument, well no, that was provoked by Khabib getting in Artem Lobov's face. All he did was call out Artem Lobov for saying he was a pussy. And I don't remember seeing a slap. I remember seeing him grab the back of his head and give him a little pat on the back of the head. Yeah, it was intimidation tactics for sure. But let me put it to you this way. I'm almost 100% certain Lobov would have been intimidated by Khabib alone. Want to know why? Because of the two fighters, and I saw this on Twitter, I loved this analogy. Conor brought 50 guys to fight Khabib. Khabib dived into a crowd of 50 people to fight all of them. That's the difference in caliber in terms of mentality. Conor talks a big game. He talks a massive game. His talk has put him into some of the biggest fights in combat sports history. But Khabib is that terrifying. He is that kind of beast. He will jump into a crowd of people and he will wrestle them all if he has to. All in all, though, it makes the UFC a hotter product. People have been saying that it's a black eye for the sport. I disagree. There are people that have been coming out, people that were not talking about the fight beforehand because it wasn't a main street fight despite the size within the MMA community. But people have come out since and they're all talking, well, why? What happened? Let's turn our attention to the UFC for a second. And say what you want. The UFC got more exposure and more traction as a result of Conor losing and Khabib going mental than if Conor had won. I genuinely believe that. I genuinely believe him taking the title back isn't as big for the UFC as Khabib winning and potentially setting up that rematch down the way. Do I think it's going to be a different result? Hell no! Khabib's winning that rematch. But at the same time, am I intrigued to see this bad blood simmer for once? Just let that rivalry keep simmering. It's like Jones and Cormier, only way more mainstream now. Jones and Cormier is an excellent feud because there's an amazing story there, and an original one at that you've got the perennial fuck-up versus the perennial clean-cut American hero guy who can't get over with the fans, even though he's supremely talented because there's this one guy that keeps beating him. Excellent story, and I love it. The Khabib Conor storyline is brilliant as well. And the reason why I say storyline is this. The fact that the UFC are leaning more and more heavily on WWE's promotional tactics is hilarious. Because two things. Number one, the UFC are almost doing it by accident, but they're not ashamed to embrace it when it suits them. Yet the WWE can't borrow some of the realism from the UFC for fear of harming their product. Imagine if those two products were a little bit closer in terms of their approach. Imagine, and I also understand, by the way, that in context, the UFC's success, it's taken a bit of a hit recently with the WWE deal with SmackDown that surpasses the UFC's deal. I understand that's a bit of a scratch in the ass for Dana White to deal with, but I would argue that the UFC is still the hotter product. I would argue that people would think the UFC is the cooler product. It's adult, it's mature, it's exciting, it's unpredictable at times. And it's constant. There's tons of content for you to consume. And yet the WWE, every time I tune into something that isn't NXT, I roll my motherfucking eyes. Every time. Kurt Angle as a conquistador? Really? I get that you wanted to have him come back, but fans cheering, this is awesome because he's dressed head to toe in a fucking golden outfit? Really? Come on now. Behave yourselves. But yeah, as far as Conor Khabib 2, Khabib for the win. Similar result to the first one, but I, for one, want to see that rematch. I would love... This is how ideally I'd like to see the situation play out. Conor takes 6 months to re-establish and re-evaluate his position. Maybe even fights Nate Diaz in the meantime, I'm not sure. If you wanted to have, in 6 months' time, you wanted to have Nate Diaz versus Conor McGregor and Tony Ferguson versus Khabib Nurmagomedov, ooh, that's a spicy meatball of a card you've got right there. I would buy the shit out of that card. But then assuming that Conor and Khabib come through their fights, have them same time next year. Have that fight same time next year. Then you've got them both coming fresh off victories. You've got the rivalry to build back off of. God damn, you've got a fight. And even then, potentially you could still have Tony Ferguson coming back at Conor McGregor afterwards. Because Conor's got that 6-fight deal now, so you need to start thinking about people it's worth putting him against. Tony Ferguson against Conor McGregor would be an excellent fight, one that the MMA fans would really, really love. And it would get Tony Ferguson a bit of shine, which in the MMA community he doesn't need, but for the wider audience he desperately needs it. And in the meantime, Cormier comes through his fight with, I've forgotten his, Derrick Lewis, and then decides whether or not he wants to take on Brock Lesnar in the new year, or potentially has a rematch with John Jones. Assuming Jones gets through Gustafsson, which I predict he will, but it will be a tough fight because Gustafsson's going to be fucking aching for that rematch. Exciting times for the UFC. Absolutely exciting times. But if Khabib is sanctioned, that is some serious bullshit right there. And I think that people need to watch that space because he's already back in Russia. He's meeting with Putin. Not sure I'm happy about that. And he's already gone to the Chechenian dictator and received himself a merc for his trouble. Again, not exactly erring on the side of moral superiority, but what are you going to do? He's making some money while he's had his purse. Considering $2 million, I'm pretty sure there's a Russian oligarch out there who's going to refund him that if he decides to leave the UFC. So that'd be the worst case scenario for all involved, because then you left a division without its champion yet again, and you're left with Conor with a diminished return on his investment. You need him to fight Khabib again and hopefully win to re-establish himself, but it remains to be seen whether that's going to be the case. So, with the UFC talk out of the way, what I would like to do now is I want to talk about me for a second. I had a conversation not too long ago with a good friend of mine. The kind of conversation that goes 7 hours. Now, to put in context, I can barely talk to anyone in real life for more than 10 minutes before I start to run out of things to say. So the fact that I would spend 7 hours in a conversation with someone kind of gives you an impression of the esteem I hold for them. However, during the midst of this conversation, I started to act very childish and churlish. And I look back and I wanted to be self-reflective about it, and the only way I can really be self-reflective about things is to talk about them, and unfortunately, I don't have enough money to pay a psychologist to analyse my mental psyche and my issues, so that's why I talk to you. So, why do I do that? Well, I don't know. I guess the main reason, I don't know if anyone else can relate to this, is because in fact, I'll relate it to my Twitter handle. Professional agitator. Why do I do Why do I sometimes pose questions I know will irritate people? Why do I sometimes take a position that I know is irritating to people? Why do I stick my opinions in other people's craw? I think it comes back to when I was a kid. When I was a kid, I was the oldest of 3, but I was the son of 2 parents who, I don't want to sound arseholish, but had priorities that didn't involve us kids at the forefront. The originals, I like to call us, me and my brother and my sister. Very, very young when my parents split up, but I've come to terms with that since. What I struggle with, though, is the interaction I had with my parents, especially in my formative years. Not so much when I was a teenager, because they tended to step up a bit more in those situations. I think because they felt more comfortable. But when I was a kid, I don't remember a tremendous amount of time spent being encouraged and being given and having gratification for the things I did and my accomplishments. This might be true of a lot of people, which is why I'm interested to see if anyone else maybe has this feeling at times. But I felt that all the time, the only occasions when I would get some attention was the adverse reaction I'd get specifically from my dad when I was annoying. And this might sound weird, because who in their right mind wants to grow up annoying? Who wants to grow up being an irritating twat? Well, when you're trying to get attention. And in certain situations in my life, I do find myself, and I can feel it after the fact. And this conversation was a great example of that. I ended up apologising to the guy after the fact and saying, look, I was an asshole, childish, apologise, no excuses. I'm just saying sorry. Because while I like to think I can hold a mature conversation, there are times when I do find myself almost erring on the side of being an idiot for a second. This is a combination of things. Number one, the attention. I don't mind the attention in that situation because there's a part of me that almost finds it funny. And that's why the irritation is that caused by other people is lessened to me, because I like the attention. I like the back and forth. I like playing off of people's anger, because ultimately I think, especially in a debate situation, I find that can open the door to a win. I feel that can open a door to me potentially highlighting a flaw in their argument that they find it hard to recover from. Not the greatest tactic in the world, and not exactly the most moral tactic in the world, but nevertheless, it's a tactic that one might use in the attempt to try and prevail in an argument. The other reason, I think, has got something to do with the fact that I like taking the opposing view on things. I like taking the underdog opposing view on things because I find it a challenge. I find it interesting to stretch my intellectual muscles in the sense of trying to win a losing argument. And I don't always win, and a lot of times I do lose. But I do find the pursuit of that kind of conversation intriguing, because then it at least allows me to highlight the flaws in another person's argument, so hopefully their argument is all the stronger for it. I sometimes even say that I argue against the people I want to win, as weird as that sounds. But the way I see it is I'm trying to keep people sharp. That's it. I'm merely trying to, look, the next time you come up against someone who actually disagrees with you, at least you'll know what they're going to say. You know what an intelligent person is hopefully going to highlight in your argument in an attempt to derail it. But the reason why I wanted to talk about this was basically to highlight the fact that I'm a very, very fucking hard person to get along with. My best friend in the whole wide world, a guy called Mickey B, he will be the first person to stick his hand up and say, I love Lorne to death, but there are times where he can be a real self-absorbed asshole. My sister, probably the most trusted person on the face of the planet with me, will tell you, I love Lorne to death. He is an intelligent and caring person, but sometimes he can really crawl up his own ass and forget how he got in there. And it's sometimes intentional. And I guess what I wanted to highlight with this is that it's a character flaw in my personality. One that I readily identify and accept. And one that I don't know if I have the mental ability to be able to control beyond being cognizant of it and being wary of it. But it's something that I nevertheless have to own and I have to work towards improving. But what I wanted to say was, if there are people out there who perhaps have similar traits, they have an aspect to their personality that they know winds people up, something that they know grinds people's gears. what's sometimes the most helpful thing to do is not to eradicate it, because unfortunately we're taught these days to embrace and love who we are. Yeah, embrace and love things that other people embrace and love about you is really what they should be saying. But nevertheless, embrace and love who you are. I'm an abrasive person. I'm a provocative individual. I can't help it. I do my best to sit in logic and to attempt to defend my beliefs as best I can. But sometimes I require a more mature personality to tell me I'm talking out my ass. And that's a character flaw I will probably have now to the day I die. They say that you never grow up really. You simply you become more adult depending on the situations. I can be very, very adult in most situations that require me to do so, but in the situations where I determine what I am or am not, I like being the goof. I like being the guy in the corner who doesn't say much, and when he does is perceived to be the dumb one in the group. I don't like being at the forefront. I don't like being the leader, as odd as it is for having a YouTube channel, but I like being in the periphery. So those rare moments where I get someone one-on-one and I get to engage with them in decent conversation, can't help it. I like to prolong that interaction as much as possible, and if that involves me being a bit of a twat, it's kind of something that I want to do. So a weird admission, but I felt like I needed to make it after that conversation, because I felt after that conversation in particular with someone who I consider to be an incredibly patient individual, someone with a good head on his shoulders, and someone with a tremendous amount of experience in the field we were debating more than myself, I was attempting to try and establish my standing, my not superiority, but my legitimacy in that field. And sometimes I will use underhanded tactics to do that. Not saying it's right, but it bothered me after the conversation, and it made me want to think about how I wanted to reflect on it. And the way I reflect on it is this: I can't promise I'm not going to be a twat in the future. All I can do is explain it and hope that it comes from a place of being positive and ultimately having something positive come out of those conversations. And if anyone else shares a similar trait, if it's being shy, if it's being overly aggressive, if it's being, again, like me, overly immature and churlish, if it's being overly arrogant and dismissive, so long as you can identify it and you make people aware up front of where it comes from as a place of insecurity or a sense of inadequacy or just a personal failing that stems from when you were younger or a specific incident, it's okay to own that, and it's okay to refine it and hone it to hopefully make it something positive. But I think you need to make that initial step, like I have in an attempt to try and make it positive. Hence why when people ask me, why do you get in debates on Twitter, and this actually came up as part of the conversation, why do I quote unquote waste my time with the conversations on Twitter? Well, it's simple. In those short bursts, I can attempt to refine my beliefs and sentiments into a hopefully positive and forward momentum building conversation block. I resist as much as I can to stop being a smarmy arsehole, because unfortunately it's proof that will be there forever. So if I'm going to say something, do I want to say something that's potentially going to alienate someone? No, I'm going to try and keep my things factual, logical, and forward progressive. It's just unfortunate that the majority of the conversations I have on Twitter don't progress. They do devolve, but I will always stick my hand up and say that it's not my fault. And if I do, then maybe I'm looking at things from a slightly different perspective, and I do need to do a better job of explaining myself. But in a long roundabout way, sorry people for being a bit of an asshole, and I appreciate you giving me the chance to make amends to anyone who I've had this kind of conversation with. So, to bring this podcast to a close, every Monday and Wednesday, you'll be getting a brand new edition of the Halcyon Blink Show from now until Christmas, to the 26th of December to be specific. From there on, I will be working to make sure that you get the same level of output every single month. Beyond that, with Razor reviews, Halcyon shows, weekly shows, additional podcasts, and a whole bunch of other ideas that I have in the works right now. But the Blinks will hopefully tide you over until then. As well, I'll be doing the mailbag with Defunct Games over on his channel, hopefully every 2 weeks going forward as well. So I'd appreciate if you go and give his channel a watch, a subscribe, a like, and give the shows that I'm on a watch, and leave questions for him to answer for you. So in the meantime, I appreciate you having a listen to this podcast. I hope you're doing well. I hope you're taking care of yourselves. I hope you like, and I hope you share, and I hope you subscribe. I hope you're checking out some of the other content creators in the description below. I hope you're following me on Twitter. And as always, I hope you're taking care of yourselves, and I'll see you guys on the next episode of the Halcyon Podcast.